The horse came back first. Dahlia Holt heard the thunder of hooves before she saw anything, and her heart lurched so violently she dropped the tin cup she'd been holding. Coffee spread across the porch boards like dark blood as she rose to her feet, shielding her eyes against the brutal Arizona sun. She knew that stride. She knew the way those particular hooves hit the earth, uneven on the left foreleg from an old injury, drumming out a rhythm she had memorized the way other women memorized hymns or lullabies. Solomon was coming home, but Solomon was not coming home alone. The man riding him was unlike anyone Dahlia had seen ride into Cutter's Creek in the 3 years she had lived here. He sat the horse like he had been born on one, spine straight as a rifle barrel, broad shoulders casting a shadow even from a distance. His duster was the color of red clay, and the badge on his chest caught the sun and threw it back like a warning. He was not riding fast. He was riding deliberate, the way a man rides when he knows exactly where he is going and has no doubts about what he will do when he gets there. Behind him, roped at the neck like a string of shame, came 3 men she recognized. Walt Greer, his brother Pete, and a hired gun she knew only as Calhoun, a man who had come to her door 6 days ago with a pistol leveled at her chest and a smile that had turned her blood to ice water. Calhoun was the one who had taken Solomon. He had told her to be grateful he had only taken the horse. Dahlia stepped off the porch and into the dust before she even knew her feet were moving. The ranger pulled Solomon to a stop 10 feet from her. The 3 roped men stumbled and nearly fell. The ranger looked down at her from beneath the brim of his hat, and she saw his eyes for the first time. They were the color of storm clouds massing over the San Pedro River. Gray shot through with green, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in a very long time. He swung down from Solomon's back in one clean motion and held the reins out to her. She could not move. 3 days of barely sleeping, barely eating, barely breathing with the grief and rage of losing the one living thing on this earth that was irreplaceable to her. And now here was this stranger, this hard-jawed, sun-scarred stranger, handing Solomon back to her like it was the simplest thing in the world. "He's yours," the ranger said. His voice was low and rough like gravel under a boot heel, but there was nothing cold in it. "I found your brand on him. Followed these 3 from the trading post at Mesquite Hollow." Dahlia's hand closed around the reins, and the leather was warm and real, and Solomon pressed his nose against her palm and breathed out, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she could not name. The ranger turned to look at the 3 men behind him, and when he looked back at her, his expression had shifted into something so fierce and certain it nearly stopped her heart. "Nobody takes from you while I breathe," he said. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from or why he had bothered, or what it cost him to ride the 3 days between Mesquite Hollow and Cutter's Creek with stolen horses and bound criminals in his wake. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could count, she did not feel entirely alone in the world. That was the moment everything changed. It had begun 6 days earlier, in the gray hour before dawn, when Dahlia had woken to the sound of the paddock gate swinging open. She had built that paddock herself, plank by plank, the summer after her husband Thomas had died of fever. Built it because Solomon needed proper shelter, and because the work had given her something to do with her hands when her mind kept dragging her back to the worst places. It was good solid construction, and the gate had a heavy iron latch that did not swing on its own. She had known, even lying there in the dark with her heart hammering, that someone was out there. She had pulled on her boots and taken the shotgun down from above the doorframe and walked out into the pre-dawn cold, and she had found the paddock empty. Solomon was gone, She had tracked the prints for half a mile before the light failed completely, and she could no longer see the ground. She had gone to Sheriff Colton, who had listened to her with the patient, empty expression of a man who had long ago decided that a widowed woman with 40 acres and no family was not a significant problem to solve. He had written her report in his ledger and told her he would look into it. She had known from the way he said it that he would not. She had gone to every man in Cutter's Creek who had a horse and asked if they had seen anything. Most of them had been politely useless. 2 of them had suggested she ought to think about selling her land and moving somewhere more suitable for a woman alone. One of them, a cattleman named Garrett who had been trying to acquire her water rights for 18 months, had suggested the same thing less politely. On the 3rd day, she had found one of Solomon's horseshoes near the Greer property line, half buried in the red dirt, and she had understood then that the theft was not random. Walt Greer had wanted her horse for months. He had offered her $30 for Solomon, which was an insult for an animal of that quality. And when she had refused, he had told her she would regret it. She had not known about Calhoun until Calhoun came to her door. He had come in the late afternoon, when the light was long and amber and the shadows stretched across the yard. He had knocked politely enough, and when she opened the door, he was already smiling, and she had known in the space of a heartbeat that the smile was a weapon being held against her throat. He had told her that the horse was gone, that it was going to stay gone, and that if she made any more noise about it, other things might go missing too. He had let his eyes travel around her property in a way that made her feel sick, taking inventory of everything she had worked for and threatening it all without saying another word. Then he had tipped his hat and walked away. She had sat down on the floor of her kitchen after he left and pressed her back against the cabinet and breathed. She had lost Thomas. She had lost the life she had imagined. She had refused to lose anything else, but she did not know how to fight 3 armed men alone, and the sheriff was useless, and she had no family within 300 miles. She had not cried. She had been too angry to cry. What she had done instead was write a letter to the Territorial Ranger Station at Prescott, a letter that was 3 pages long and every word of it was precise and damning. She had ridden to the postal rider herself, the man named Josiah who made the run between Cutter's Creek and the main road 3 times a week, and she had pressed the letter into his hands and told him it was urgent. She had not expected a response in less than 2 weeks. She had certainly not expected a response in 6 days in the form of a man on her stolen horse leading her thieves home in ropes. His name was Fletcher Kane, and she learned this when he turned from her, walked back to where his own horse was tied to the fence post, and produced a folded document from his coat pocket, which he pressed into Sheriff Colton's hands. Colton had emerged from his office at the commotion, and now he stood in the street with his mustache twitching and his authority visibly crumbling around him. "Territorial warrant," Fletcher said. "Walt Greer, Pete Greer, and Milo Calhoun, charged with horse theft, destruction of private property, and criminal intimidation. I'll be transporting them to Prescott in the morning." Colton read the warrant with the expression of a man who had swallowed something bitter. "Now, Ranger, there's some question about the circumstances here." "There's no question," Fletcher said. "The horse is branded. The brand matches the woman's deed of property. These 3 were in possession of a stolen animal and made threatening communications to the animal's rightful owner. The warrant is valid and the charges are supported." He said all of this without raising his voice. He did not need to raise his voice. He was the kind of man whose certainty carried its own weight. Dahlia was watching him from beside Solomon, one hand still on the horse's neck, And she noticed the way the townspeople who had gathered on their porches and in doorways were watching him too. There was a quality to Fletcher Kane that she could not immediately name, something that had nothing to do with his badge or his size or even the weathered competence in every line of him. It was something quieter and more fundamental than any of those things. He had ridden 3 days to return a horse to a woman he had never met. That was not required of him. A ranger could have sent a deputy, could have returned the animal through a local handler, could have done any number of things that did not require personal investment. But he had come himself, and he had brought the thieves with him, and when he had looked at her and said those words, there had been nothing performative about it. She had spent enough years around men who performed their virtue to know the difference. The Greer brothers and Calhoun were locked in the jail that night, and Fletcher saw to his own horse, a dark roan named August, in the stable at the edge of town. Dahlia had come to tell him there was food at her place if he wanted it, because she did not know how else to begin to account for what he had done. He had looked at her for a moment with those storm cloud eyes, and then nodded once. She had made beef stew with dried onion and the last of the winter carrots, and cornbread that she had been saving the good flour for, and she set it on the table in the kitchen that was her favorite room in the house because she had painted it herself, the walls a pale yellow that caught the evening light and held it. He had come in and taken off his hat, and she had seen his hair for the first time, dark brown and shot through at the temples with silver, though he could not have been more than 34 or 35 years old. There was a scar along his jaw, faded to white, old enough to have its own history. He had eaten with the quiet focus of a man who had been riding hard for days and had not eaten properly, and she had waited until he had worked through most of the bowl before she said anything. "You came yourself," she said. He looked up. "You didn't have to," she said. "You could have sent someone." He considered this in the same deliberate way he seemed to consider most things. "Your letter described an ongoing threat and a sheriff who was unwilling to act. That's not a situation where you send someone. That's a situation where you go." Most people would not have seen it that way. "I'm not most people," he said, without any arrogance in it, just a statement of fact. She refilled his coffee and sat back down across from him. The lamp between them threw warm light over the table, and outside the window the Arizona night was making all its particular sounds, the insects and the distant coyotes and the settling of the earth after the day's heat. "How did you find them so fast?" she asked. 3 days is not much time." "I know the trading routes between here and the New Mexico line," he said. "A horse like yours doesn't stay invisible. He's a distinctive animal. I started asking at every stop between Prescott and Mesquite Hollow, and by the second day someone had seen him. Greer's brother had him stabled at the hollow, not even hidden properly. They thought distance was enough. They underestimated," she said. "They always do," he said. And there was something in his voice then, not bitterness exactly, but the weight of someone who had spent years watching people make the same mistake. She asked him about the ranger service, and he talked about it with the careful honesty of a man who was not given to embellishment. He had been a ranger for 11 years, based out of Prescott for the last 4. Before that, he had been in the Northern Territories, working cattle fraud cases and violent crimes. He had grown up in New Mexico, on a small ranch east of Albuquerque, the youngest of 3 brothers. He told her this without telling her much else, the way people talked when there were parts of a story they kept for themselves. She understood that instinct. She kept parts of her story too. She told him about Thomas, because it seemed fair. She told him about the farm in a straightforward way, the acreage and the water rights and the apple orchard she was slowly nursing back to health after a drought year. And she told him about Solomon, about how Thomas had given her the horse as a wedding gift. A 3-year-old with a coat like red autumn and a personality twice as big as the animal itself. "He's the last thing I have from that time," she said. "Not the last thing I have, but the last living thing." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know what that is, holding on to something alive because everything else is gone." She looked at him across the lamplight. "What are you holding on to?" she asked. It was too personal a question for a first conversation with a stranger, and she knew it even as she said it, but something about the way he had said those words made her feel that he would not mind the directness. He did not mind it. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her and said, "My brother's dog. His name is Copper, ugliest animal you ever saw." "Your brother died," she said, "3 years ago." "I'm sorry." "The dog is ridiculous," he said, and she heard the grief under the amusement. "Barks at his own shadow, refuses to sleep anywhere but the foot of my bed." She almost smiled. "Solomon bites anyone who tries to brush him except me." "Good instincts," Fletcher said. "That was how it started." Not with grand declarations or stolen glances or the dramatic mechanics of romance novels, which Dahlia had read enough of to know. They rarely accounted for the particular texture of two people sitting across from each other in a lamplit kitchen after a crisis, finding to their mutual surprise that they did not want the conversation to end. Fletcher Kane stayed in Cutter's Creek for 3 days, which was longer than required for a simple warrant transport. He told himself, and possibly believed, that it was because he needed to ensure the proper transfer of the prisoners to the county seat and to document the case for the territorial office. Both of those things were true. They were not the only things that were true. He found reasons to pass by her farm. He helped her repair a section of fence that the Greer brothers' hired men had damaged when they came through her property 3 weeks back on some unrelated business that had left its mark on her gate posts. He did not ask to help. He saw the damage and picked up the tools that were leaning against the barn wall and began to work, and when she came out to tell him he did not have to, he said, "I know," and kept working. She brought him water and then picked up a hammer herself, and they worked for 2 hours in the afternoon sun without speaking much, and it was one of the most companionable 2 hours she had spent in years. On the second evening he was still in town. She brought food to the stable where he was checking August's feet, a wrapped bundle of cornbread and cold chicken, and found him sitting on an overturned crate talking quietly to his horse in a way that was so unself-conscious and tender that she stood in the doorway for a moment without him seeing her, caught by something she did not want to examine too closely. He looked up when August's ears pricked toward her, and there was no embarrassment in him, no performance of having been caught in a private moment. He just looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "August has an opinion about nearly everything." "Solomon does too," she said. "Mostly negative." "They get along terribly," he said, and she did laugh then, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in months, and she saw something shift in his expression when she did, something that went briefly unguarded before he pulled it back. She noticed it. She filed it away. On the morning of the 3rd day, he came to her door before sunrise. She was already up, because she was always up before sunrise, and she answered in her work clothes with flour on her hands from the bread she had been starting, and he was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and an expression she could not read. "I have to take them to Prescott today," he said. "I know," she said. "The case is solid. Greer and his brother will be sentenced. Calhoun has priors, so he'll go to federal prison." He paused. "You won't have trouble from them again." "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every part of herself. He turned the hat in his hands. "The Garrett situation troubles me," he said. She had mentioned Garrett only briefly, only the part about him wanting her water rights, and she was surprised he had retained it and considered it. "It should trouble you," she said carefully. "He has money and influence in this county, and the sheriff is sympathetic to him. The sheriff receives Christmas gifts from him every year, good ones." Fletcher's jaw tightened slightly. "If Garrett makes any move against your property or your person, you write to the office at Prescott. Ask for me specifically. The address is on this." He produced a card from his coat pocket, thick paper with the ranger office's information on it, and she noticed that he had written his name on the back in a hand that was careful and clear. She took the card and held it. "Why specifically you?" she asked. There it was again, that thing in his expression that moved beneath the surface like water under ice. "Because I know your situation now," he said, "and because I want to know if you're all right." She looked at him for a long moment. "Fletcher," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name and she saw him register it. "Dahlia," he said. "Come back when you can," she said. "Not because of Garrett, just come back." He was quiet for one breath too, then he said, "I will." He rode out an hour later with 3 prisoners in tow, and she watched him go from the porch with Solomon standing beside her, and the Arizona morning breaking open overhead in colors too beautiful for the difficulties of the world below them. She told herself she was not going to spend the next weeks watching the road. She watched the road. It was not a passive, pining watching. She was not a passive woman. She planted the second field of alfalfa that she had been putting off, and she began serious negotiations with the apple orchard, pruning the weakest branches and treating the diseased ones with the sulfur mixture she had read about in the farming almanac. And she rode into town 3 times a week to sell eggs and butter at the market, which she had been doing since the first month after Thomas died and had never stopped. She asked around quietly about Ranger Fletcher Kane. What she learned from the territorial office's public records, which she requested formally and received 3 weeks later, was that he had commendations for valor in the line of duty, a record of successful case closures that was notably high, and no disciplinary record. She learned from the postmaster, who knew everything about everyone because he had been in Cutter's Creek for 30 years, that a ranger with Kane's description had passed through twice in the last 2 years on separate case business, and had been described as thorough, fair, and unusually polite to people that other rangers sometimes dismissed. She learned from Josiah the postal rider, who had heard it from a man in Prescott, that Fletcher Kane had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman named Clara who had married someone else after Fletcher had been assigned to a long case in the Northern Territories, and they had grown apart across the distance. Josiah had delivered this information with the gentle discretion of someone who knew it mattered. She had not known what to do with it, so she had put it in the same place she put other important things and let it settle. He wrote to her first. The letter arrived 5 weeks after he left. It was written in the same careful hand she had seen on the card, and it was 3 pages long, which surprised her. She had expected something brief and professional. What she received was something different. He wrote about the Prescott sentencing, which had gone as expected, the Greers receiving 2 years each and Calhoun receiving 7 in the federal penitentiary at Yuma. He wrote about August developing an irritating new habit of refusing to cross certain bridges for no discernible reason. He wrote about a case he was working in the mountains east of Prescott, something involving land fraud that was complicated and frustrating. And he described it with the kind of honest professional frustration that made her feel she was reading the private thoughts of someone who trusted her with them. At the end he wrote, "I think about Cutter's Creek more than I should for a place I was only in for 3 days. I think I am actually thinking about the person I met there. I'm not certain how to say that properly, so I have just said it plainly." She read that last paragraph 4 times. She wrote back the same day, 12 pages, because once she started, she found she had things to say that had been accumulating for years without an audience that felt worthy of them. She told him about the orchard, about the first tentative signs of recovery she was seeing in the trees. She told him about a dispute she had gotten into with the local grain seller over pricing that she had won through sheer research and patient argument. She told him about a book she was reading, a collection of natural philosophy essays that she had ordered from a catalog, and what she thought of it, and what she thought he might think of it. At the end she wrote, "I am glad you said it plainly. I prefer plain things. I think you knew that, which is why you said it the way you did. Come back when you can come back, and if you can't, keep writing." They wrote to each other for 6 weeks. His letters arrived every 10 to 14 days and were always surprising, in their depth and in the small details he chose to include, the kind of details that told her something real about who he was. He wrote about the dog, Copper, who was apparently staying with a widow in Prescott who kept dogs for rangers on long assignments, and about the woman's other charges, a collection of animals of various questionable temperaments. He wrote about his mother, who was still alive and still on the New Mexico ranch, and about how he called on her when cases took him near enough. He wrote about what the work cost him sometimes, not in graphic terms but in honest ones, the weight of carrying responsibility for people's safety and the complicated mathematics of justice in a territory where law was still young and imperfect. She wrote about Thomas in a way she had not been able to write about him to anyone, about how their marriage had been good and honest and had contained real love, and how grief had a particular loneliness that was different from ordinary loneliness, because it was the absence of a specific person rather than the absence of connection in general. She wrote about how she had decided, in the second year of widowhood, that she was not going to become smaller, that she was going to keep building things and learning things and caring about things, because the alternative was a kind of death that came before the actual dying. His response to that letter was the shortest one he sent, only half a page, but she read it more times than any of the others. He had written, "I have known a lot of people in the Western Territories who have been through hard things. Most of them become either very hard themselves or very broken. You became neither. I would like very much to understand how you did that. I think it might be the most important thing I have never learned." The letter after that was the longest he had sent, 12 pages, and he had included in it a pressed flower from the mountains near Prescott, which she had not expected from him, and which she had pressed again inside a book of botanical illustrations she kept on her nightstand. He came back in late October. She was in the orchard when she heard August's particular, uneven bridge refusing gait on the road, and she knew it was him before she turned around. She had started to know the sound of his horse the way she knew Solomon's, which was information about herself that she had been carefully not looking at too directly. She turned, and he was riding up the lane with the October light behind him, and he looked different from how she remembered and exactly the same. She had been painting him in memory with the specific quality that memory gives to people who matter, and seeing the real man again was a readjustment that was somehow better than the image she had been carrying. He dismounted at the paddock gate, and she walked toward him through the fallen leaves, and they stood looking at each other for a moment with all 6 weeks of letters between them like something visible in the air. "The orchard looks better," he said. "The orchard is better," she said. "I told you about the sulfur treatment. You did. It worked. It did." He was looking at her with the directness that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important, and she did not look away. "I have a week," he said. "I asked for it specifically." "A week is not very long," she said. "No," he said. "I know. "You should stay at the farm," she said. "The boarding house in town is uncomfortable and expensive, and there's a spare room here." He looked at her. "That's not very proper," he said, but there was nothing censorious in it, only an acknowledgement of the social geometry of the situation. "I don't much care about proper," she said. "I care about practical. The room is clean and you would be comfortable." He stayed at the farm. It was the best week she had lived in 3 years, possibly longer, and she knew it while it was happening, which was an unusual gift. They fell into a rhythm almost immediately, the kind of rhythm that takes most people months to find, and some people never do. She was up before dawn, and so was he, and they drank coffee on the porch in the early morning silence before the world got loud. And it was a silence that felt like something built rather than something absent. He helped with the farm work without making it feel like charity, which was a skill she was beginning to think was rare in men. He could read a fence line and assess structural issues, and he was useful with animals in the particular way that people are useful who have spent their lives understanding them. He spent an afternoon with Solomon, patient and steady, and Solomon, who did not like anyone, allowed himself to be groomed, which Dahlia watched from the barn doorway with a feeling she could not completely categorize. In the evenings they sat by the fire and talked, and she began to understand the shape of him more fully. He had a sense of humor that was dry and quiet and easy to miss if you were not paying attention, and she was paying attention. He had opinions about justice and law, and the ways the territorial system was failing certain populations that were more complex and honest than she had expected, and he expressed them with a directness that matched her own. He had read more than she had assumed, not everything, but widely, with the eclectic taste of someone who read for genuine curiosity rather than performance. On the third evening, he told her about Clara. He did not know she already knew, and she did not tell him. She just listened, and he told it plainly, the way he did things. They had been young, both of them, and the distance had been real, and the decision to end it had been painful, but had been, he thought, the right one, because they had wanted different things, and the different things had simply become more visible across the space between them. He did not sound bitter about it. He sounded like a man who had processed something fully and set it down. "I have been cautious since," he said, "about letting anything matter too much." "And now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. Then he said, "I rode 3 days to return a horse, and I have written 20 letters in 6 weeks to the woman who owned it, and I asked for a week of personal leave, which I have never done in 11 years of service." "What does that say?" "It says you are not being very cautious," she said. "No," he said. "I am not." She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over his, and his hand turned and held hers, and they sat that way in the firelight for a long time without speaking, because there are moments when speaking would be smaller than silence. On the 5th day, Garrett came. She had known he would eventually. She had not expected him that week, and she was mildly furious about the timing in a way that had more to do with not wanting anything to interrupt what was happening than with genuine fear of the man. She had moved past genuine fear of Garrett several months ago and settled into a more useful, steady wariness. He came with 2 of his men, which was what he always did when he came to her property, a display of force that was meant to make her feel small. He rode a big palomino and wore the clothes of a man who wanted you to know he could afford good clothes, and he tipped his hat to her with the false courtesy of someone who had spent their whole life confusing money with authority. He had not expected to find Fletcher Kane standing beside her. The moment he registered the badge was interesting to watch. Garrett was a man of certain self-possession, and he recovered quickly, but she saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment. "Miss Holt," he said with that elaborate courtesy. "I heard you had some trouble with the Greer outfit. Sorry to hear it." "You were not sorry when it was happening," she said pleasantly. Garrett's smile tightened. He looked at Fletcher. "Ranger." "Mr. Garrett," Fletcher said, "I know who you are. I imagine you do. I also know about the water rights dispute. I know about the 3 separate offers you've made for this land in the last 18 months. I know about the complaint Miss Holt filed with the territorial office regarding your hired men's trespass on her northern boundary in August." Fletcher's voice was entirely conversational. "I want you to know that this property and this person are known to the Ranger Service at Prescott. Any action taken against either will be treated as a territorial matter." Garrett looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Dahlia. Then back at Fletcher. "I'm just here to make a business offer," he said. "She's not selling," Fletcher said. "I was speaking to Miss Holt," Garrett said with an edge in it now. "Then speak," Dahlia said, "and I'll tell you myself." Garrett made his offer. It was more money than the last time, considerably more, which told her that the water rights were worth even more than she had understood. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he was finished she said, "No. The answer is no now and will be no next month and will be no in 5 years. The farm is mine. The water rights are mine. If your cattle are thirsty in summer, I suggest you invest in better wells." Garrett looked at her with something that was not quite fury but was adjacent to it. And then he looked at Fletcher, and something passed between them. That was the silent language of men measuring each other. Garrett tipped his hat again and rode away. When they were gone, Fletcher let out a breath and she heard the control in it, the deliberate release of tension. He had been very still during the conversation, the particular stillness of someone managing something carefully. "He won't stop," Fletcher said. "I know," she said. "But he'll be more careful about it." "That's not enough." "No," she agreed. "But it's today's problem solved, and today is what we have." He looked at her with something that was very close to admiration, and she felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. That evening they walked the perimeter of the property together as the light died, and she showed him all of it, the boundary markers and the water access point and the northern field where she was planning to put in winter wheat. And as they walked, she was aware of his hand occasionally brushing hers, and of the care in the way he listened when she talked about her plans, not just politely, but actually hearing her in the way that made her want to keep talking. They stopped at the edge of the orchard where the last of the late-season apples were still on the trees, and the sky above them was going from red to violet to the deep blue of approaching night. "Dahlia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have to go back the day after tomorrow." "I know." "I don't want to," he said, and it was said with such simple honesty that it reached directly through all her armor. "I have spent 11 years building a life that fits inside itself, case to case, place to place. And now I am standing in an apple orchard in Arizona, thinking that my life has a gap in it in the shape of a person I have known for less than 2 months." She turned to look at him. His face in the violet light was serious and open, and she thought she had been right from the beginning. This was not a man who performed things. "I am not a person who moves quickly," she said. "Thomas and I knew each other for 2 years before we married. I am built for certainty, not speed." "I know," he said. "I am not asking for speed. I am asking for permission to keep coming back." "You don't need permission for that," she said softly. "You have it. You had it from the day you left." He reached up and pushed a strand of dark hair back from her face with a gentleness that was startling in a man his size. And she let herself lean just slightly into his hand, and he was so still, so careful, as if she were something he did not want to startle. "I'll be back before Christmas," he said. "I'll be here," she said. He kissed her for the first time in that orchard, soft and certain at once, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like the frantic urgency she had read about in novels, and everything like the truest thing she had experienced in years. He left 2 days later, and she was not bereft about it, which surprised her. She was steady about it in a way she had not expected, as if something that had been waiting for resolution had been resolved, not completed but set in motion, and set in motion with enough intention that she trusted its direction. She had been right not to be bereft. He was back before Christmas. He came 3 days before the holiday, and he brought Copper. The dog was every bit as ridiculous as described. He was a medium-sized, patchy brown creature with one ear that stood up and one that fell over, and a personality that seemed to consist primarily of enthusiastic wrong-headedness. He barked at Solomon twice, discovered that Solomon would not be moved by barking, and then spent the rest of the visit following Solomon around at a respectful distance, with an expression of complicated admiration. Fletcher had managed to get 2 weeks at Christmas, and he told her he had been given additional leave because of commendations related to the land fraud case in the mountains, which he had broken 3 weeks earlier, and which had resulted in a notable arrest, and the recovery of contested land for several families who had been defrauded. She had read about the case in the territorial newspaper, which came to Cutter's Creek twice a month. She had read about it with the particular interest of someone who knows the person described in the article, reading for the things between the lines, the parts of the story that only she would know were there. Christmas at the farm was something she had been dreading as a concept, and had instead managed to make warm for herself through a combination of stubbornness and practice. She had decorated with pine boughs from the high country that Josiah brought down on his postal runs, and she had made Christmas foods that she and Thomas had loved, and then decided, 2 years ago, to keep making them because they were good foods and grief had no right to them. Fletcher helped her make Christmas dinner with the earnest ineptitude of a man who had spent most of his adult life eating at boarding houses and campfires. He could roast a rabbit over an open fire with skill, but he was dangerous with a roasting pan in an oven, and she found this disproportionately endearing. She taught him to make her cornbread recipe, and he was a good student, precise and attentive, and she thought that those were his best qualities in a single sentence: precise and attentive. They ate Christmas dinner together with Copper under the table and Solomon visible through the kitchen window in the paddock, and she lit the good candles she had been saving, and there was wine she had kept from a case Thomas had bought the last Christmas before he died, and she opened a bottle, and they drank it slowly and talked about everything and nothing, the particular wandering conversation of two people who are comfortable enough with each other to have no agenda. After dinner, he gave her a gift, wrapped in paper she recognized from the general store in Prescott. Inside was a small brass compass engraved on the lid with a line of text. She read it, and then read it again. The text said, "For when you need to find your way back to something worth returning to." She looked up at him across the candlelight. "That's what you said in your letter," he said quietly. "You said you had decided not to become smaller, to keep building and returning to things worth returning to. I thought it fit." She did not say anything for a moment, because the specific accuracy of the gift, the fact that he had been listening closely enough to hear something she had said about herself and given it back to her in a form she could hold, was doing something considerable to her composure. "Fletcher," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you," she said. "I thought you should know." The expression that moved across his face was not surprise, not exactly, but something more like the face of a person who has been waiting for confirmation of something they hoped but were not certain of. He set down his wine glass and reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. I have been in love with you since approximately the second letter, he said. Possibly since the orchard. I have been trying to be patient about saying so. You don't have to be patient about it anymore, she said. He came around the table and she stood up and he held her, one hand against the back of her head, her face against his shoulder. And she felt the steady drum of his heartbeat and thought, there it is. That's the sound of something real. 2 weeks went quickly. They always do when you want them to go slowly, and she had learned enough about the nature of time to stop trying to argue with it. She held each day with the flat of her palm rather than the fist, the way her mother had taught her to hold small creatures when she was a girl. So they did not panic, and so you did not crush them. He had to go back, and he did, and they both knew the situation was untenable in the medium term. They were writing letters and stealing weeks, and that was possible for a while, but it was not a life. She had thought about this since October, and she suspected he had been thinking about it longer, given what she knew of how he operated. The letter that arrived in February was different from the others. It was longer even than usual, and he had clearly rewritten it. She could tell by the care of the language, the way it was more constructed than his usual directness. He was trying to get something right. He wrote that the territorial service was establishing a new station in Tucson, which was closer to Cutter's Creek than Prescott. He had been offered a transfer and had not accepted it yet because he wanted to discuss it with her. He wrote that Tucson would put him a day's ride from Cutter's Creek rather than 3 days, and he wrote that there was a secondary consideration, which he had been turning over for months, which was whether she would consider, at some point, not any point set in stone, but at some point, whether she might consider allowing him to ask her to marry him. He had written it exactly like that, the elaborate grammar of a man who was being very careful not to presume. She wrote back the same day. She wrote, "Accept the transfer." And yes, you may ask, he accepted the transfer. He was in Tucson by March, and a day's ride was an entirely different thing than 3 days, and she saw him twice in March and twice in April, and the letters did not slow down even though the distance had, because they had discovered they liked writing to each other, liked the particular form of honesty that letters permitted, and so they kept writing even when they had just seen each other. He asked her properly in May, in the orchard, which was fully in bloom for the first time in years, the sulfur treatment having worked better than she had dared hope, the trees covered in white blossoms that smelled like something from a world that had no difficulty in it. He went down on one knee, which she had not expected, and he held a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small sapphire in a gold setting that was old and unpretentious and beautiful. And he said, "Dahlia Holt, I have never been certain of much in my life except the work, and now I am certain of you. Will you marry me?" She said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married in July of 1879 in Cutter's Creek, which was not a town she had chosen but which had become hers through the accumulated weight of years and work, and the particular roots that grow sideways when you are not looking. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who came through every 2 months and who had a deep, warm voice and an evident love of his work. There were perhaps 30 people present, more than she had expected, because it turned out that the town had opinions about her that were mostly favorable, formed over 3 years of watching her refuse to be defeated. Fletcher's mother had come from New Mexico. Her name was Ruth Kane, and she was a small, sturdy woman with her son's gray-green eyes and an evaluating directness that Dahlia recognized because she had it herself. Ruth had looked at Dahlia for approximately 30 seconds at the first meeting and then said, "You're the woman who wrote the 3-page letter," with evident approval, and that had been the foundation of what became a genuine warmth between them. Copper attended the wedding and behaved himself reasonably well, which was better than expected. Solomon wore ribbons because Dahlia had put them on him, and he had allowed this in the spirit of the occasion, though he made his opinion of them clear by removing 2 of them before the ceremony and eating 1. The reception was at the farm because where else would it be? And it lasted until late in the evening with food and dancing on the packed earth yard to music, provided by a fiddler named Albert, who had been playing at Cutter's Creek celebrations for 20 years and knew exactly what he was doing. Fletcher danced with her, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, not polished but genuine, which was the better thing to be, and she danced with him until the stars were out overhead and the night was warm, and she thought, "This is the kind of happiness that is made rather than found, built board by board and letter by letter and day by steady day." Fletcher did not give up ranging immediately. The work was too much a part of him, and she would not have wanted him to because it was one of the true things about him, the thing that had sent him 3 days down a hard road to return a horse to a woman he had never met. But the nature of his ranging changed with the Tucson posting, shorter assignments, regular returns, and after the first year he was offered an administrative position with the territorial office that would keep him largely based in Tucson. And he took it because it was offered to him honestly, and because it meant coming home more. He came home to the farm on Fridays when he could and sometimes on Tuesdays when the work allowed. And when he could not come home he wrote. And when he wrote, it was always the same quality of attention, the kind that made her feel that she was the specific person he was thinking about when he wrote, which was because she was. The Garrett situation resolved itself with a completeness that was almost satisfying. She had known it would resolve eventually, because men like Garrett operated on the assumption that enough pressure applied over enough time produced results, and what they did not account for was a woman with a ranger husband and 3 years of legal documentation and a very clear understanding of territorial property law. Fletcher had quietly built a case over the winter, working with the territorial attorney in Tucson, documenting every instance of trespass, every suspicious offer, every piece of evidence that Garrett had been operating outside the law in his land acquisition strategy. In the spring following their marriage, the territorial attorney filed charges. The case went to trial in Tucson in August, and Garrett was found guilty on 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of criminal coercion related to a different property case that had been attached to the investigation. He paid a considerable fine and lost his operating license for cattle ranging on territorial land for 5 years, which hit his business significantly. He did not come to Cutter's Creek after that. Sheriff Colton was replaced the following spring by a woman from Yuma named Agnes Farwell, who had been appointed through the territorial reform process that was slowly, imperfectly, remaking the legal infrastructure of the Arizona Territory. Agnes Farwell was formidable and meticulous and profoundly uninterested in Christmas gifts, and she and Dahlia became friends over shared frustrations about various inadequacies of local infrastructure, a friendship that was useful and also genuinely enjoyable. The winter of 1880 was hard, as winters sometimes were in that territory, with ice storms that came down from the high country, and a week of temperatures that killed 3 of her apple trees despite everything she could do. She grieved the trees honestly, because she had worked hard for them, and Fletcher sat with her in the kitchen while she told him about it with the straightforward sadness of someone who did not have to perform stoicism around him, because he was a person who had made it clear from early on that he did not require her to perform anything. In the spring, she planted 2 new trees to replace the dead ones, and she chose varieties she had been curious about. A late-season apple from the east that the agricultural catalog recommended for high-altitude western conditions. She was thinking long-term. She was always thinking long-term now, which was different from how she had thought in the first years after Thomas died, when the long-term had felt like a threat rather than a promise. Their first child was born in the spring of 1881, a boy they named James, after Fletcher's father, who had died when Fletcher was 17. James Kane came into the world at 4 in the morning with considerable announcement, assisted by the town's physician and by Ruth Kane, who had come down from New Mexico for the occasion, and who proved to be as competent at this as she was at everything else. Fletcher held the baby in the first hour after birth with an expression that Dahlia had not seen on him before. Not the steady certainty she knew, not the careful attention, but something more fundamental and more moved. He held his son and he looked at her over the baby's head with gray-green eyes that were wet at the edges, and she thought, there are some things a person builds slowly over years, and some things that arrive whole in an instant, and both kinds are real. James was a considerable baby, in terms of personality from approximately the first week. He had Fletcher's directness and Dahlia's stubbornness, and a laugh that he deployed with strategic effectiveness. And she loved him so fiercely it occasionally alarmed her, because love of that magnitude is not comfortable, it is simply necessary. Copper adored James with a loyalty that bordered on obsession. The dog had relocated from the Prescott widow's establishment to the farm when Fletcher transferred to Tucson, and he had been a fixture on the property for 2 years before James arrived. And the arrival of James gave Copper a purpose that he embraced with his whole patchy self. He slept at the foot of the boy's cradle and later his crib and eventually his bed. And James grew up understanding that the dog was a permanent and devoted presence in his life, which was a good thing to learn young. Fletcher's work in Tucson continued to matter. He was good at the administrative side in ways he had not fully anticipated, because the skills required attention to detail, systemic thinking, the ability to hold large amounts of information in careful relation to each other, were skills he had always had, but had applied differently in the field. He built a reputation in the territorial office for closing cold cases through archival work, finding the thread that had been missed, following it to its source. He testified before the territorial legislature twice on matters of law enforcement reform. He was offered a higher appointment in Prescott and declined it because it would have taken him farther from the farm and from his family. And the work he was already doing was work he believed in. He told her about the declination the evening after he made it, sitting on the porch with James asleep inside and the night-blooming jasmine that she had planted along the fence starting to open in the July heat, its smell coming to them in waves. "You could have taken it," she said. "I wouldn't have asked you not to." "I know," he said. "That's not why I didn't." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the orchard, which was in its best year yet. 15 trees now counting the 2 new ones. And the late season, apple varieties proving themselves exactly as good as the catalog had promised. "I grew up watching my father make the calculation wrong," he said. "He chose the work and the range over being present. My mother understood it. She was that kind of woman, but understanding something and being whole despite it aren't the same. I don't want to make that calculation wrong." She looked at his profile in the July night. "You are not your father," she said. "No," he said. "But I have his capacity for certainty about work, and I've spent enough time watching what happens when a man is more certain about his work than about anything else. I don't want to be that story." She took his hand. "You're not that story," she said. "You've never been that story." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, a gesture he made sometimes that she had come to understand was his particular form of tenderness, and said quietly, "Because of you. Because of both of us." she said. Solomon died in the autumn of 1882, peacefully and in full possession of his personality, which meant he died as he had lived, biting the vet who had come to assess his condition and leaning his weight against Dahlia's side in the way he had always done. She was with him when he went, sitting in the paddock with his large red head in her lap, and Fletcher was there too, having ridden home from Tucson the moment she sent word that Solomon was declining. She cried then, which she had not allowed herself to do through most of the difficult things. She cried because he was the last thread of Thomas, and because he had been her companion through the hardest years, and because the grief of animals is its own particular species of loss. Fletcher held her in the paddock with the autumn sun overhead and did not say anything for a long time, just held her, which was the right thing. They buried Solomon at the edge of the orchard where she had planted a red stone to mark the place, and in the spring she planted a tree beside the stone, another late-season apple, and it grew strongly in the years after, which she took as something, not a sign exactly, because she was a practical woman, but something. She let herself breathe with the loss. She did not get another horse for 8 months, and when she did, it was a young mare, a 3-year-old with a dark gray coat, and an attitude that reminded her of Solomon enough to make her laugh when she was not expecting to. She called her November, for the month in which she arrived. Their second child was born in 1883, a girl they named Ruth, for Fletcher's mother, who was still alive and still formidable, and received the news of her granddaughter's naming with the only visible emotion that Dahlia had ever seen from her. A long, blinked silence followed by a statement that she would be coming to visit in the spring. Ruth was quieter than James had been, but no less determined, with her mother's dark hair and a habit of watching things very carefully before she decided what to do about them, which Dahlia recognized in herself. James was 4 when Ruth arrived and responded to her arrival with the generous enthusiasm of a child who has been prepared well. And he was an excellent older brother, attentive and only occasionally tyrannical. Fletcher was 40 by this point, and she was 36, and they were both in the fullness of what their life had become. He had gray at his temples now that had spread to gray throughout his hair, and she thought it suited him, thought it looked like everything he had done and learned and decided settled into a visible form. He had lines beside his eyes from years of squinting into western sun, and he had kept the lean strength of a man who spent a great deal of time in motion. And she still sometimes caught herself watching him cross the yard with a quality of attention that was not very different from what she had felt watching him dismount from Solomon's back that first morning. She had lines of her own, around her eyes and along her hands from years of work, and he looked at her in a way that made it clear he saw them as part of the same thing he had always seen, the woman who had built something out of loss and refused to become smaller, and she believed him. They celebrated their 5th anniversary in July of 1884 by going back to the orchard in the evening when the children were with Ruth Kane, who had made a visit down from New Mexico, and could be trusted to handle 2 children of various temperaments for an evening without incident. They took a bottle of wine and a blanket and sat under the apple trees that were heavy with early summer fruit, and the grass was tall around them, and the sunset was doing its particular Arizona extravagance overhead. 5 years, he said. 5 years, she agreed. There was a version of me, he said, who would have spent those 5 years doing exactly what I was already doing, case to case. Prescott to the Northern Territories, boarding house food and copper at the foot of the bed. That doesn't sound terrible, she said. It doesn't sound terrible, he agreed. It sounds like a life that fits inside itself. The problem is that a life that only fits inside itself can't grow. She looked at him. And this one has grown. He looked at her with all of it visible in his face, the children and the farm and the letters and the orchard and the years of coming home, and said, "Every single day." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the orchard as the sun went down. And it was exactly the right size, this life. Exactly the size that two people build when they build it together on honest ground. In the years that followed, Cutter's Creek grew. The railroad came through 50 miles north of the town in 1886, and the consequent development brought new businesses and new families and new complications, as development always does. Dahlia adapted to all of it with the pragmatism she had developed over 15 years of managing the farm through conditions that did not consult her preferences. She expanded the farm's operations to sell to the new merchant establishments, and the apple orchard became a modest local enterprise, her varieties being notably better than the imported eastern apples that came in on the rail and cost considerably more. Fletcher was promoted to regional supervisor for the Southern Arizona Territorial Service, a position that he accepted in 1887 because the work had been consolidated in a way that put most of it in Tucson, and he was not going to be required to travel more than he had been. He supervised 12 rangers and spent a portion of each week training new recruits, which suited him, the transfer of the specific knowledge he had accumulated over 2 decades of working cases. He was a good teacher for the same reasons he was a good ranger. He was precise, he was patient, and he was honest about what the work required. James was 6 when he started following his father around on Saturdays asking questions about everything. Fletcher answered them all with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, and Dahlia watched them together sometimes with the particular pleasure of seeing a thing done right. James was going to be tall. It was already obvious in the length of his legs and the size of his hands, and he had a straightforward decency about him that she thought was the best possible combination of his parents. Ruth at 4 was keeping her own counsel, watching the world with her careful dark eyes and making determinations about it that she shared selectively. She had developed a strong attachment to November the mare, which Dahlia considered deeply appropriate, and she spent hours in the paddock talking to the horse in the low, earnest voice of someone explaining important matters to an audience she trusted. Copper died in the winter of 1887, of simple old age, peacefully, in his usual position at the foot of James's bed, where he had relocated from his original position at the foot of Fletcher's bed after James had arrived, and Copper had made his reallocation of devotional resources. They buried him under the red stone near Solomon's tree, because it seemed right to put things you loved together, and James was 7 and cried with the honest grief of a child who has lost his first significant companion and does not yet know how to diminish the feeling. Fletcher sat with James afterward and told him about his own brother, about loss and about what you carry forward, and she listened from the doorway of the kitchen and thought that this was one of the things you could not plan for when you were building a life, the moments when the grief you have accumulated becomes the tool with which you teach someone you love how to carry theirs. They had a third child in 1889 when James was 8 and Ruth was 6. A second son they named Elias, for no particular historical reason except that she liked the name and Fletcher had said it suited the quality of the evening when he was born, which was quiet and amber and completely still. Elias arrived with considerably less drama than his older siblings, and seemed to intend to approach the world the same way, a quality that proved consistent as he grew. He was an exceptionally peaceful child, and then a peaceful boy, which was startling in a household with 2 older siblings of notable personality, and which everyone was grateful for. By 1890, the farm had been operating for 12 years. The orchard had 20 trees. November had produced 2 foals, one of which they had sold and one of which Ruth had claimed as her own with a completeness that brooked no argument from anyone. James had started at the schoolhouse in Cutter's Creek and was excelling at mathematics and argumentation, both of which his teachers found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. Ruth had a talent for drawing that had emerged quietly and was becoming evident in charcoal sketches, pinned to the kitchen wall that Dahlia had been saving since Ruth was 5. Fletcher was 45 and she was 41, and she loved him with the accumulated weight of 12 years of building something real, which was a different love than the orchard blossom love of early things, but was larger and more various and contained multitudes. It contained the love of 10,000 mornings of coffee on the porch, and the love of hard conversations navigated honestly, and the love of watching someone be exactly who they said they were across years and changing circumstances. It contained the love of being known, fully and without performance, which she had decided was the best thing one person could offer another. On their 11th anniversary, he took her back to the orchard, which had become their particular place for significant things, and they sat under the trees in the July evening with the apples scent heavy around them, and the children inside in the care of Agnes Farwell, who had become one of Dahlia's closest friends, and was an excellent and terrifying babysitter. He did not bring wine this time. He brought the compass. She had not seen it in some time. She kept it in the small box on her dresser with other irreplaceable things: Thomas's wedding ring, the pressed flower from Fletcher's first letter, the card with the Ranger office address that she had never needed to use again after Garrett, and she was surprised when he produced it from his coat pocket. He turned it over in his hands. "I keep thinking about what I wrote on this," he said. "For when you need to find your way back to something worth returning to," she said without needing to look. "Yes," he said. He looked at her. "I thought I was giving you something when I gave you this. I thought it was about you finding your way. I was wrong about what it was actually about." "What was it actually about?" she said. "It was about me," he said simply. "I was the one who needed to find my way back to something worth returning to, and you were it. You have always been it. I just didn't know yet how to say so." She took the compass from his hands and held it, the brass warm and familiar, the weight of it the weight of 11 years of being found. "You say everything eventually," she said. "Just in your own time." He looked at her across the long evening light. "Thank you for waiting," he said. "Thank you for coming back," she said. "Every single time." He kissed her in the orchard, as he had the first time, but with all the years between then and now present in it. All the letters and the seasons and the losses and the celebrations and the children and the work and the quiet mornings and the difficult conversations and the particular comfort of someone who has chosen you, consistently across a long and imperfect time. Above them, the apple trees held their fruit in the summer heat. Across the yard, through the kitchen window, she could hear James asking Agnes Farwell a question she could not make out, and Agnes's voice rising in the amused exasperation of a woman who respected intelligence, even when it inconvenienced her. From the paddock, the sound of Ruth's low voice talking to her horse drifted through the evening air. Somewhere inside, Elias was probably sleeping the peaceful sleep of a child who had decided the world was essentially all right. The farm was exactly the farm she had built, and the life was exactly the life she had made, and it was full in every direction she could look. In 1892, Fletcher retired from the territorial service. He did it at 47, which was younger than some retired and older than many survived the work, and he did it at a moment of his own choosing, which was the only right way to do it. He was given a commendation by the territorial governor and a formal ceremony in Tucson that he attended with Dahlia on his arm and James, who was 11, standing beside him with an expression of enormous pride that he was trying to look casual about. He came home to the farm and found that there was a great deal more to be done there than he had always been aware of, and he did it with the same precision and attention he had brought to everything else. He expanded the farm's water management, installing a proper irrigation system that served the orchard and the alfalfa fields in a way that survived even the dry years without significant loss. He managed the commercial relationships for the orchard sales with the same systematic competence that had made him effective with case documentation. He was also simply there, every morning on the porch with coffee and every evening at the table and every night in the bed that was hers and had been theirs for 13 years. She had not known how much she had been quietly adjusting to his absences across all those years until the absences stopped, and she understood then that she had been carrying a small, constant weight of incompleteness that she had simply incorporated into her day, the way you incorporate any chronic minor pain. When the weight lifted, she felt the difference in her whole self, a kind of ease that was new and entirely welcome. James grew into a young man who went to study law in Tucson at 17, funded by the orchard proceeds and his father's savings, and who came home on Sundays when he could, arriving with his mother's directness and his father's careful attention and an accumulation of opinions about territorial law that he was not shy about sharing at dinner. Ruth at 15 had begun to sell her drawings, small landscapes of the farm and the surrounding country, through the general store in Cutter's Creek, and through a merchant in Tucson who had seen them and been interested. She was not shy about the art, but she was private about the process of making it, in the way that some artists are, and the kitchen wall had long since been claimed by her work entirely. Elias at 6 was following November's foal around the paddock with the focused devotion of a child who had decided where his interests lay, which was, apparently, precisely where his mother's had been at the beginning. In 1895, the year that James passed his bar examination in Tucson and was admitted to practice law in the Arizona Territory, they had a celebration at the farm that lasted most of the weekend and included Agnes Farwell and the minister who had married them, now very old but still warm and deep-voiced, and a number of people from Cutter's Creek who had become part of their life across the years. Ruth painted a portrait of James for the occasion, oil on canvas, his face with his mother's dark eyes and his father's gray-touched hair, and the exact expression of a young man who has worked hard for something he wanted and is quietly certain of his place in the world. She gave it to him without ceremony, just set it against the chair at his place at the table, and he looked at it for a long moment and then at his sister and said, "This is who I want to be," and she said, "I know. That's who I painted." Ruth Kane, the grandmother, died in 1896 at the age of 78, in New Mexico on the ranch where she had lived her whole life. They traveled there for the burial, all of them, and Fletcher stood at his mother's grave with the same stillness he brought to the things that cost him, and Dahlia stood beside him with her hand in his, and she thought about what it meant to come from people and to be made of them and to carry them forward. And she thought Ruth Kane had been worth being carried forward, being a woman of considerable substance who had done what needed doing without making too much noise about it. They came back to the farm from New Mexico in October, when the orchard was in its harvest, and the picking of the apples had been managed by James and Elias in their absence with a competence that surprised exactly no one in their family, and probably should have surprised them less than it did. The years after that were the quiet years, which is not the same as uneventful. Fletcher was in his 50s and she was in her late 40s, and they were not old, but they were settled in the way of people who have made something durable. And there was a pleasure in that durability that she had not anticipated when she was young, a pleasure in knowing that the things you built were holding. The farm was holding. The orchard was holding. The water rights were secured. The children were grown and growing into their own versions of themselves, which were original and unexpected and entirely good. She found him one morning in the orchard, in the late autumn, when most of the apples were taken and the trees were beginning their turning. And the light was the low, sideways light of October that made everything look like something worth keeping. He was standing beside Solomon's tree, which had grown enormous over the years and bore more fruit than any other tree in the orchard. And he was simply looking at it with that particular quality of looking that she had learned to recognize as his form of genuine engagement with things that mattered. She walked across the fallen leaves to stand beside him. "Thinking about Solomon," she said. "Thinking about the day I found him," he said. "Thinking about what I would have missed if I hadn't gone myself, if I had sent a deputy, if I had filed the paperwork and let the Greer case sit." She looked at the tree. "You would have missed quite a lot," she said. "Everything," he said simply. "I would have missed everything." She took his arm and leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together under the big tree with the October light falling through its branches. And she thought about what it was to have a life that had been built rather than happened, chosen deliberately and maintained with intention, piece by piece and year by year. From the moment a stranger had ridden out of the desert on her stolen horse and said words that had broken something open in her. "Nobody takes from you while I breathe." He had meant it as a statement of protection. She had taken it as one in the moment. But what it had been, she understood now, what it had actually been was a statement of commitment. He had made himself responsible for her before he even knew her name, not out of paternalism or obligation, but out of something more elemental, the instinct of a person who recognized something worth protecting and had the will to act on it. She had not needed protecting for a very long time. She had needed a partner, someone who understood what she was building and wanted to build it with her, who would come back because returning was part of the thing rather than a courtesy. She had needed someone who would say difficult things plainly and hear difficult things without flinching, and be precisely who he said he was across years and hard weather, and the ordinary, impossible complexity of living with another person. She had, she thought, gotten exactly what she needed. "Fletcher," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you came yourself," she said. He pressed a kiss to the side of her head. "So am I," he said, "every single day." Above them, Solomon's tree reached its branches into the blue October sky, and the last of the season's apples caught the sun and held it, red and perfect and enduring. The farm lay around them in its autumn gold, every fence post and water line and carefully tended row of it, a record of years spent in the best possible way, building something real with someone worth building it with. From the direction of the house came Elias's voice, calling for his mother with the urgency of a 13-year-old who has encountered a problem that requires immediate adult input. She smiled. "That's us," she said. "That is always us," he said, and she heard the contentment in it, the complete and unperformed contentment of a man who has exactly the life he wants. They walked back through the fallen leaves toward the house, toward the children and the noise and the work, toward everything they had made between them. She was 49 years old and he was 53, and the Arizona sky was enormous overhead, and the orchard was behind them, and the life was ahead of them, as it always was, as she had decided it always would be, for as long as they were both standing in it together.